Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 4 books that I finished since the last time I did a short book review. So every week I try to come with you with the books that I have finished reading and give you a short idea of what they were about and how I liked them. So let me go ahead and get started. And in case you're wondering, no, I did not finish these 4 books in 1 week. There has actually been a little bit of a time gap between my last set of book reviews and this one, and that's just because my monthly wrap-up was in the middle of that. All right, let's get into it because I've got a couple to go through. The first book I'm going to talk about is called Counsel Culture. This is written by Hye-Jin and is translated from Korean by Jamie Chang. This was first published in 2014. It's a work of literary fiction and it is put out by an independent press called Restless Books. And I got this when I was trying their book subscription. And I think it's only one of a couple of their books that I've read so far. But let me go ahead and tell you what this book is about. This book is about the protagonist, Hae-Soo. At the start of the book, or really before the book starts, she is a well-known therapist who frequently makes guest appearances on a popular television program. And at one point when she is appearing on this show, she is given a script of what to say and comment on in regards to a public figure. That public figure shortly thereafter unalives themselves. Hae-Soo suddenly finds herself having to deal with the backlash that comes, and we follow her story and how she ends up being canceled by her workplace, her friends, her jobs, all the things, the public, social media, and all that can be involved in that. And so this is both a book that gets into some of the dynamics of counseling, but most particularly cancel culture. Now, I thought it was interesting because in this book, we are following the person who gets canceled. And if you're wondering, like, this is not necessarily making her a pitiable figure. It is definitely discussing the nature of cancel culture, but I think it's from a point of view that doesn't often get looked at, which is the person who gets canceled. And I thought that was a really unique challenge to take on. And so we follow her as she tries to recover from this experience and figure out how she's going to put her life back together. In doing so, she ends up meeting both a young 10-year-old girl who she strikes up an odd friendship with as they try to save a street cat. And there was a lot of symbolism in all of the different experiences that she has, relationships that were reflecting her own in different ways. This book discusses bullying, cancel culture, isolation, grief, forgiveness, loneliness, and it handles all of them really well. And I think that was one of the things that I really liked about it. It really gives you some compassion for the protagonist while at the same time trying to navigate, like, where did she truly go wrong? Where does she need to seek forgiveness? Is there any place in this for her to have self-pity? And you also see her walk the fine line of starting to victim blame, but realizing she needs to pull back on that. The only low in this book for me was I did feel like there were times where the messaging was not heavy-handed, but maybe a bit more obvious and forward than I would have personally liked it. I get there is a really subtle balance in there, and so that was just something that sometimes I was like, oh, I wish it was a little more subtle in places, but it wasn't enough to be distracting or make it bad. I would recommend this book to anybody who likes character studies, found family, or anyone who would just like to look at a book that explores the idea of cancel culture. Next, I read another work of literary fiction, and that is The Edge of Water. This is written by Olufunke Grace Bankole and was published in 2025. Yep, I read a book published this year, and this is put out by another independent press, in this case, Ten House Press. And I love this book partially just because I loved the cover of the book. Was this partially a cover buy? Slightly. However, I did also buy it because it is a mother-daughter story, and I do like stories that explore family relationships, and this one definitely does. This tells the story of Esther and particularly her daughter Amina, and it starts in Nigeria, going over their relationship and a lot of the miscommunication that was involved in their mother-daughter relationship early on in life. Eventually, Amina decides to leave Nigeria and move to New Orleans in the US. And so we also get to see sort of their long distance, ocean aparts version of their relationship, where they are still trying to figure out how to say to one another what they really meant to communicate, as well as get the final things they have to say one another out before it's too late. Because Amina is in New Orleans just before Katrina hits. And so it's interesting how there is also the involvement of a major disaster kind of impending in the background. There is a storm that threatens to ruin their opportunity to finally come together and understand one another. It doesn't help that Esther has also had Amina's fortune told, and that in that there is a lot of references to water. This book covers a lot of topics, including mother and daughter relationships, miscommunications that can happen within families. It gets into the backstories of both women and talks also a lot about the cultures, tradition, and folklore that exist in Nigerian culture. I really appreciated this story mainly at the end, if I'm honest. I actually felt like there were some pacing issues in the middle of the book, and that was kind of disappointing. I was really hopeful that this would be a book that I absolutely loved, and it turns out I love the cover of the book slightly more than the content. However, the end of the story really did save it. I think it just took too long to get to the climax. We did get a lot of discussion of the mother's childhood and background and like her marriage before we got to Amina and her background with her mother. And I wish somehow that had been able to be condensed slightly, which is saying a lot because this is not a particularly long book, but somehow the pacing of that just suffered. I almost want to say it's just because it's kind of marketed as a mother and daughter book and doesn't start there. That was the problem, but I really don't think that was it. Like by the time we got to Amina in New Orleans and everything there, it was going really well. I almost kind of wish the story had just started there and had shorter flashbacks to earlier in their life, but coulda, woulda, shoulda. That's not what the book did. And for what it was, I ended up giving it 3.5, which is not bad. It just wasn't as good as I was hoping. I think this is a really good book for anybody who likes mother and daughter relationships and would like to explore that more. I think it's also a really good book for learning just a little bit more about family and relationships and Nigerian culture. So if those are things that are interest you, then give it a try. I was also able to pick up The Eye in the Door. This is the second book in the Regeneration trilogy by Pat Barker, and I was very excited to get to this book. I am buddy reading the entire trilogy with a friend. We read Regeneration earlier this year, and both of us absolutely loved it. We were excited to continue on with the story, but we were also kind of confused how the story was going to carry on because book one felt very resolved and very completed, and like it could have been a standalone. Because this is book two in the series, I'm not going to tell you a lot of specifics about this book, but I will tell you what the series in general is about. The Regeneration series is an anti-war novel series that is set in World War I in Britain, and it really follows the anti-war movement. It follows the impact of the war psychologically. It follows the psychological impact of the war on the soldiers, and also gets into the dynamics of and tensions that were going on in Britain in society in general, specifically as directed towards men. The Eye in the Door itself discusses, again, more psychology, PTSD, shell shock that was going on at the time, including the symptoms and treatments of it. It also gets into topics surrounding the idea of a split nature, like the good and the bad side of man, duality in people's personalities in general, and that was probably my favorite part of the book. It discusses homophobia and like how rampant that was in the society at the time, and also really gets into the paranoia that was starting to pervade British society at this point in the war. An Eye on the Door specifically is set in the spring of 1918. My favorite parts of this book, kind of like in book one, were the characters, the themes, and the various topics that Pat Barker covers. She covers a lot of each. There are quite a few characters in here who you get their points of view at times and you get to follow them. She has multiple messages that she weaves throughout and handles very well. And she also covers a lot of different topics in this book. If I had one complaint, it would probably be that I felt like too many of the subplots in the book were left open at the end. I get it's book two and we have a third book coming, but it still left me feeling like there were certain things that she could have resolved that should have been resolved because they were such minor plot points. And I'm a little trepidatious going into book three because there's so much to wrap up at this point. And so, unlike book one, which felt like it was a standalone, this definitely felt like it was part of a series, but not in that satisfying, like, cliffhanger type of manner. Just in a, like, oh, you're just not going to come back to that kind of way? And the answer was no, no, she's not. So that left me with some mixed feelings. I still gave the book 4 stars. It was hard not to compare it to the first book, which I'm pretty sure I gave 5 stars to. But we'll see. I think a lot of my feelings about this series as a whole are going to depend on how that final book goes. I would still recommend both the first book and this book to anyone who likes historical fiction, particularly historical fiction set in war times. But I think this book is really unique. One, in terms of it's talking about the First World War, where a lot of books tend to talk about the second one. But I also think it's unique just in terms of she's really zeroing in on a particular group of people and looking at the psychology of what was going on at the time. There is definitely no straightforward hero here because you definitely get to have some anti-hero vibes, but you're also just diving deep into that, like, what is good, what is bad, how do you handle the fact that people have mixed emotions about everything that is going on. And I think that's what makes this such a great book. And speaking about having mixed emotions and the idea of duality, the next book that I read talks about both, and that is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is not a book that I had on my radar to read right now, but it became the next logical book to pick up because The Eye in the Door in its epigraph actually has a quote from this book, and this book is mentioned multiple times within The Eye in the Door and is also quoted again within the book. And the reason being, as I mentioned, is that it talks about duality, and the major theme in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has to do with the duality of men. So let me tell you some more about this book. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a work that I would consider like sci-fi gothic horror. It was first published in 1886, and the framing of the story is that there is a lawyer named Mr. Utterson who is starting to notice some very strange habits of his good friend and client, Dr. Jekyll. And Mr. Utterson spends a decent amount of the story going around trying to unpack the mysterious isolation that Dr. Jekyll is keeping himself under, as well as explain all his bizarre behavior. This book really dives deep into the themes of good versus evil and how both can exist within one person, and whether or not that means we are two different beings struggling to overcome one another. I really enjoyed this reading that I did of this. It really surprised me. I thought it was well paced. I thought there was a lot of good tension. It almost felt like a thriller throughout. It was atmospheric. It very much had those gothic, atmospheric, foggy, cloudy, settings and that kind of thing. And I really liked all of that. The biggest lows in this book were there were occasional moments where I think because Robert Louis Stevenson was trying to keep some information from the reader, his writing started to become a bit convoluted. And it was odd because the vast majority of this book is pretty accessible and easy to read. So you definitely had moments where you're like, why are you writing this like that? But it only happened happened maybe like twice throughout the whole book, so that wasn't as big a deal. I do still think that for a classic, some people might want a little bit of a content warning with this, just in terms of it does use a trope, the trope for the monster, that the monster is, you know, deformed compared to everybody else, and that's part of the horror. So if that's something that you don't like in books, then know that there is a little bit of that in here. It really just comes up 2 or 3 times and not extensively, but I do think it's worth sharing, because if you don't want to read that at all, then you might want to skip that. If you want a similar story that handles the idea of a monster looking horrible and the impact on the monster and society itself, read Frankenstein. That handles all of that way better. That said, I don't think this is a book to overlook. I still personally gave it 4.5 stars. I think it is a book that really gets into like experiment and science gone wrong. So if you like that trope in sci-fi or horror, then I think this is a good book for that. It does veer off just from being about the Mr. Hyde side of Dr. Jekyll, and it really tells you the backstory of how that came to be and why, and does a very deep dive into the idea of, you know, duality in men and every person having like 2 natures that they're struggling with, and how do we resolve that, or how do we come to be at peace with that, and can we come to peace with that? So this is definitely something to explore if that interests you. That is it. Those are the 4 books that I had to discuss today. Let me know, have you read any of these books? Have you enjoyed them, and what your thoughts are? I hope you are having a great reading week, and I will talk to you next time.